In 1984, in a laboratory in London, a biochemist named Mark Thomas is studying something that has nothing to do with milk. He is mapping genetic mutations across human populations in Europe, Africa, and Asia. What he finds stops him cold. A single genetic mutation. One tiny change in the human genome. It appeared somewhere in northern Europe roughly 7,500 years ago and spread through the population with a speed that geneticists almost never see in evolutionary data. It spread faster than the mutation that gives humans upright posture. Faster than the one that produced larger brains. In evolutionary terms, it spread almost overnight. The mutation allowed adults to digest milk. Before it existed, every human being on Earth over the age of 4 or 5 lost the ability to process lactose, the sugar in milk, permanently. Drinking milk as an adult meant cramping, bloating, and violent illness. The human body treated it like poison. Then this one mutation appeared, and everything changed. The people who carried it survived famines that killed their neighbors. They outlived droughts. They reproduced at higher rates and passed the mutation to their children. Today, roughly 35% of adults worldwide can fully digest milk. In Northern Europe, that number reaches 90%. In some East African pastoral communities, it reaches 99%. In parts of East Asia, it remains below 5%. That single number, where you fall on that spectrum, was shaped by what your ancestors did with animals 10,000 years ago. And it may be the single most consequential genetic event in all of human dietary history. But the mutation is only one part of the story. Because before the mutation, humans were drinking milk anyway. And the reason they did, and what they did to make it survivable, and how that decision traveled from a Stone Age settlement in Anatolia to the refrigerator in your kitchen, is a story that runs through every civilization that ever rose to power, through wars and famines and religious ceremonies, through the collapse of empires and the birth of industries, and through one of the most effective and disturbing propaganda campaigns in the history of modern food. If you find this kind of story worth knowing, the kind that hides inside ordinary things, consider subscribing. There is more where this came from. Around 10,000 years ago in the region that is now Turkey, Syria, and northern Iraq, something happened that historians call the Neolithic Revolution. Humans who had spent hundreds of thousands of years following animals across landscapes began staying in one place. They planted seeds. They built walls. And they began keeping animals not just for meat and hides, but alive, in enclosures, for sustained use. The first animal domesticated for milk was almost certainly the goat, followed closely by the sheep, and then the cow. No one decided to do this in a single moment. It was a gradual process of observation that a tethered animal could provide protein repeatedly without being killed, that a female animal with young would produce more than her offspring needed, that this excess liquid could be collected. The problem was that almost no adult human could safely drink it. What early herders almost certainly discovered, by accident, through desperation, or through observation of what happened when milk was left in an animal's stomach or a clay vessel in warm weather, was fermentation. When milk sours, when bacteria convert its lactose into lactic acid, it becomes something different. Yogurt. Cheese. Kefir. The lactose that caused illness breaks down in the process. The result is a food that even the lactose intolerant can consume without serious harm. And so the first great transformation of milk was not drinking it. It was breaking it down into something the human body would accept. The earliest direct evidence of dairy processing was found in 2012, embedded in the fabric of ancient ceramic pots excavated in northwestern Anatolia. Milk fat residues, confirmed by chemical analysis, dating to approximately 6,500 BC. Those pots were not used for drinking milk. Analysis of their shape and residue patterns suggests they were used for making cheese or yogurt. The first dairy product in human history was not a glass of milk. It was probably something resembling a soft, sour curd. And it fed people who had no other reliable source of complete protein between the harvest and the next planting season. Egypt left records of almost everything. Tax registers, battle accounts, religious ceremonies, the daily rations of pyramid laborers. But milk appears rarely in the central records of Egyptian civilization. The reason is practical and geographical. The Nile Valley is hot. Milk spoils within hours. Without refrigeration, without the cold of northern climates to slow bacterial growth, liquid milk was nearly impossible to store or transport. Egypt had dairy animals. It produced cheese and butter. But it was not a milk-drinking civilization in any meaningful sense. Mesopotamia was different. The Sumerians, operating in a slightly cooler climate with access to grasslands, developed what may be the first organized dairy industry on record. In the British Museum today, there is a limestone frieze discovered at the Temple of Ninhursag in Iraq, dating to approximately 3000 BC. It shows figures milking cattle, filtering milk, and storing it in large vessels. It is the oldest known visual record of dairy farming. The Sumerians had words for butter, cheese, and at least a dozen varieties of fermented milk. They recorded dairy transactions on clay tablets as economic entries alongside grain and silver. Milk, even in its earliest bureaucratic form, was already money. The civilization that turned milk into a philosophical and religious category was neither Egyptian nor Sumerian. It was Vedic India. In the religious texts of the early Vedic period, roughly 1500 BC onward, the cow occupies a position unlike any other animal in the history of human civilization. She is not simply useful. She is sacred. Killing her is not merely wasteful. It is a moral transgression. And the reason is almost certainly economic before it is theological. A living cow in an agrarian economy produces milk, butter, and ghee continuously for years. A dead cow produces meat once. The religious prohibition on killing cattle that became codified in Hinduism was almost certainly, at its origin, a rational economic decision made by pastoral communities who understood the long-term value of the living animal. The sacred cow was the first protected agricultural asset in human history. Ghee, clarified butter made by simmering butter until the water evaporates and the milk solid separate, became the most important substance in Vedic ritual. It was poured into sacred fires as an offering. It was used to anoint kings. It was described in the Rigveda as the fat of the earth, as liquid sunlight, as the substance that connected the physical world to the divine. Ghee could be stored for months, even years, without refrigeration in the right climate. It was portable, dense in calories, and ritually powerful. In a world without refrigeration and with limited protein sources, it was almost miraculous. India still consumes more dairy than any other country on earth. Today it produces nearly a quarter of the world's milk. The supply chain that delivers that milk runs through a cooperative network built in the 1970s called Operation Flood, one of the largest agricultural development programs in history, which transformed India from a dairy-deficient country into the world's largest milk producer within 2 decades. The roots of that network run back 3,500 years to a Vedic hymn about clarified butter poured into a sacred fire. The Greeks inherited cattle from Bronze Age civilizations and used them primarily for meat, labor, and sacrifice. But Greek writers documented something important about position unlike any other animal in the history of human civilization. She is not simply useful. She is sacred. Killing her is not merely wasteful. It is a moral transgression. And the reason is almost certainly economic before it is theological. A living cow in an agrarian economy produces milk, butter, and ghee continuously for years. A dead cow produces meat once. The religious prohibition on killing cattle that became codified in Hinduism was almost certainly, at its origin, a rational economic decision made by pastoral communities who understood the long-term value of the living animal. The sacred cow was the first protected agricultural asset in human history. Ghee, clarified butter made by simmering butter until the water evaporates and the milk solid separate, became the most important substance in Vedic ritual. It was poured into sacred fires as an offering. It was used to anoint kings. It was described in the Rigveda as the fat of the earth, as liquid sunlight, as the substance that connected the physical world to the divine. Ghee could be stored for months, even years, without refrigeration in the right climate. It was portable, dense in calories, and ritually powerful. In a world without refrigeration and with limited protein sources, it was almost miraculous. India still consumes more dairy than any other country on earth. Today it produces nearly a quarter of the world's milk. The supply chain that delivers that milk runs through a cooperative network built in the 1970s called Operation Flood, one of the largest agricultural development programs in history, which transformed India from a dairy-deficient country into the world's largest milk producer within 2 decades. The roots of that network run back 3,500 years to a Vedic hymn about clarified butter poured into a sacred fire. The Greeks inherited cattle from Bronze Age civilizations and used them primarily for meat, labor, and sacrifice. But Greek writers documented something important about you cannot make Parmigiano Reggiano anywhere else on earth and have it taste the same. The Romans did not understand why. They simply knew that the cheese from that region was the best, and they bought it. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD, European dairy production did not disappear for the same reason that European wine production did not disappear. The monasteries. Benedictine and Cistercian monks required protein sources compatible with their dietary restrictions on meat consumption during religious observances. Cheese and butter filled that role. Monastic dairies became centers of dairy innovation across the early medieval period. Monks in the Swiss Alps developed what would eventually become Gruyere. French monks in Burgundy were producing a washed rind cheese with a distinctive odor that local populations had been making for centuries, but that monastic production refined and scaled. English monasteries near the village of Cheddar in Somerset, which sits at the entrance to a series of caves with a consistently cool temperature ideal for aging, developed a pressed, aged cow's milk cheese that now bears the name of the village and is the most consumed cheese variety on earth by volume. Cheddar, the food inside your refrigerator at this moment, was developed by medieval monks using caves as refrigerators, shaped by the specific geology of a Somerset valley, and refined over roughly 600 years before industrialization transformed it into a global product. The cave is still there. You can visit it. This is a good moment to subscribe if you have not already. These are the kinds of stories this channel tells, the ones hiding inside things you have seen every day without knowing what they carry. The 16th and 17th centuries brought dairy to a crossroads that almost ended it. As European cities grew and populations concentrated, the logistics of delivering fresh milk from rural farms to urban consumers became almost impossible to manage safely. Milk from cows kept in filthy urban dairies, animals fed on the waste grain from distilleries, confined in conditions that produced chronically sick animals, was being sold directly to city populations. The milk was often contaminated before it left the barn. Tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, and diphtheria were all transmitted through raw milk in European and American cities throughout the 1800s. In New York City in the 1850s, what became known as swill milk, produced from distillery waste-fed cows in Lower Manhattan, was killing an estimated 8,000 children a year. 8,000 children a year. In a single city. From milk. The solution came from a French chemist who was not studying milk at all. Louis Pasteur was working on wine and beer spoilage in the 1850s and 1860s when he demonstrated that heat could kill the microorganisms responsible for fermentation and contamination without destroying the liquid itself. The process was named pasteurization. Its application to milk was not immediate. The dairy industry resisted it. Producers argued that heating milk changed its flavor, which it did, slightly. Consumers were suspicious of a product that had been chemically altered, which it had not been, but the perception persisted. The first city in the United States to mandate pasteurization of commercially sold milk was Chicago in 1908. New York followed in 1912. Full nationwide requirements took decades more. In the interim, the death toll from contaminated milk in American and European cities was staggering. Pasteurization was not embraced. It was imposed after resistance, after lobbying, after the kind of slow institutional failure that always precedes a public health catastrophe that was in fact entirely preventable. Today, pasteurization is so standard that most people in developed countries have never tasted raw milk, and in many jurisdictions it is illegal to sell it. The bacteria that once killed 8,000 children a year in a single city are gone from the commercial supply. But the debate about raw milk has not ended. It has simply migrated from public health boards to internet forums, from bacterial contamination statistics to questions about enzymes, gut bacteria, and what industrial processing removes along with the pathogens. That debate is ongoing, and it is more complicated than either side typically presents. The 20th century did something to milk that no previous civilization had managed. It turned milk into an ideology. In the United States between the 1920s and the 1970s, the dairy industry, in collaboration with federal nutrition policy, constructed what nutritional historians now describe as one of the most successful food marketing campaigns in history. The campaign had a simple message delivered through school lunch programs, government dietary guidelines, and decades of advertising. Milk builds strong bones. Milk is essential for children. 3 glasses a day is the minimum for health. Got milk. The science was real. Milk contains calcium, protein, vitamin D in fortified form, and a dense package of nutrients. But the science was also selectively presented. The studies used to establish recommended dairy consumption were often funded by the dairy industry itself. The recommended serving sizes were calibrated not purely to nutritional need but to market demand. The dietary guidelines that placed milk in a separate category of essential foods, distinct from other calcium sources like leafy vegetables, legumes, or fortified alternatives, were shaped in part by the political power of the dairy lobby, which remains one of the most influential agricultural lobbies in the United States to this day. The result was a generation of nutritional assumptions that are only now being systematically re-examined. The Harvard School of Public Health removes dairy from its alternative healthy eating plate. Meta-analyses of calcium supplementation through dairy versus other sources have produced results more complicated than the 3 glasses a day message implied. And in 2020, the United States government's own dietary guidelines quietly reduced the recommended dairy servings while the dairy industry's advertising budget remained unchanged. This does not mean milk is unhealthy. For the populations that can digest it fully, it remains one of the most nutritionally dense whole foods available. But it means that the story of milk in the 20th century is not simply a nutritional story. It is a political one. And the distinction matters. The person who first collected milk from a domesticated animal somewhere in ancient Anatolia 10,000 years ago was solving an immediate problem. How to feed a community through a season when other food was scarce. They were not thinking about calcium. They were not thinking about dietary guidelines. They were not thinking about advertising campaigns, genetic mutations, or the price per kilogram of aged cheese at a specialty grocer in New York. They were thinking about survival. The Cistercian monk who recorded the precise aging conditions of a particular cheese in a limestone cave in Somerset was solving a different problem: how to feed a monastery through Lent. He was not thinking about global distribution, industrial standardization, or the fact that the food he was refining would still be manufactured 800 years later in a factory in Wisconsin. Louis Pasteur, heating wine samples in a Paris laboratory, was not thinking about the 8,000 children dying annually from milk in American cities. He was thinking about fermentation kinetics. The solution he found was not designed for milk. It was borrowed from a different problem and applied to one he never personally encountered. This is how most of the systems that now govern daily life were built. Not by grand design. Not by committees with long-term vision. But by accident, improvisation, economic desperation. Religious obligation, political compromise, and the gradual accumulation of observations made by people who were simply trying to solve the problem directly in front of them. The mutation that allows 90% of Northern Europeans to drink milk as adults did not spread because anyone decided it should. It spread because the people who carried it survived conditions that killed those who did not. Natural selection is not a plan. It is a record of which gambles paid off. Today, the global dairy industry produces approximately 930 million metric tons of milk per year. The United States, India, the European Union, China, and Brazil are the 5 largest producers. China, which as recently as the 1980s had almost no domestic dairy industry and a population with among the lowest rates of lactose tolerance in the world, is now the 3rd largest milk consumer on Earth. Its dairy consumption has increased by more than 600% since 1990, driven by urbanization, rising incomes, and the same Western nutritional messaging that shaped American dietary habits half a century earlier. New Zealand exports 95% of the dairy it produces. Its economy is structured around the assumption that the rest of the world wants its milk products, an assumption built on trade relationships, shipping logistics, and refrigeration infrastructure that did not exist 150 years ago. Lab-grown dairy, proteins produced by yeast or bacteria engineered to express milk proteins without an animal, is already commercially available in limited markets. Perfect Day, a California company, has produced whey protein identical at the molecular level to cow's milk protein using a fermentation process not structurally different from what those Neolithic herders in Anatolia stumbled onto when they left milk in a warm clay vessel and came back to find it transformed. The oldest technology in this story and the newest one are, at their core, the same process. Microorganisms transforming milk into something the human body can use. The clay vessel has become a stainless steel bioreactor. The Neolithic herder has become a biochemical engineer. The product is, molecularly, the same. The bottle in your refrigerator, white, cold, pasteurized, vitamin D fortified, branded with a logo designed by a marketing agency and subject to price regulations set by a government dairy board, is the endpoint of a 10,000-year journey that runs through the temples of Vedic India, the caves of Somerset, the laboratory of Louis Pasteur, the swill dairies of Lower Manhattan, the advertising offices of mid-century America, and the genome of every human being alive. It passed through a genetic bottleneck 7,500 years ago that altered the biology of entire populations. It was processed by monks, carried by armies, poured into sacred fires, pressed into limestone caves, heated in Parisian laboratories, and sold by campaigns that shaped what a generation of children believed their bodies required. It survived every civilization that carried it and outlasted several that tried to do without it. Not bad for the biological secretion of a domesticated bovine that a desperate Neolithic farmer decided was too valuable to waste.